Hey everyone, this is your host, Peter Zablocki, and you're listening to the History Shorts podcast. I hope everyone's having a great day so far, and thank you so much for making this show a small part of that. If you'd like to help me out with a small gesture, please leave History Shorts a rating or a review, and click that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. For sources and books used as the basis for these episodes, how to advertise on a show, and other information such as a list of our upcoming guests on the Conversation series, or a link to our Patreon account where you can listen to exclusive episodes not heard here, please visit www.historyshortspodcast.com. Today's episode is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate podcast listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the globe, all in one place. Download Podcast Republic now and take your podcast experience to the next level. Having said all of that, in the winter of 1935, the United States stood at a crossroads. The Great Depression, a cataclysmic economic collapse, had begun with the stock market crash of 1929, had now left millions unemployed, banks shattered, and the national economy in freefall. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected in 1932 on a promise of bold, persistent experimentation, had responded with an unprecedented flurry of legislation collectively known as the New Deal. These initiatives, ranging from the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, to the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, and the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, sought to stabilize financial institutions, provide direct relief to the unemployed, regulate industry, and revive the American economy. Roosevelt's administration framed these measures as necessary interventions to preserve not only economic stability, but also social cohesion in a nation teetering on the edge of despair. The Supreme Court, however, had other plans. Here is the rest of that story.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941,
it's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Even as the New Deal programs were being enacted with remarkable speed, I should say, they were already encountering formidable constitutional resistance. The United States Supreme Court, at the time composed of a majority of conservative justices, perceived many New Deal initiatives as overreaches of federal power, encroachments on the states' rights, and violations of the separation of powers outlined in the Constitution. From the outset, a tension was brewing between Roosevelt's activist vision and the court's traditionalist interpretation of constitutional limits. This tension reached its dramatic climax in 1935 and 1936, in a series of rulings that temporarily threatened to dismantle the legislative efforts Roosevelt had so urgently constructed. The first major confrontation came in the case of Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States in 1935, often referred to as the sick chicken case. The National Industrial Recovery Act, a cornerstone of Roosevelt's economic strategy, had authorized the president to approve codes of fair competition for industries, regulating wages, working hours, and production quotas. Under these codes, businesses were required to adhere to standards set in consultation with industry associations, effectively giving the federal government the power to supervise virtually every aspect of commercial activity. Schechter Poultry, a small poultry business in Brooklyn, challenged the government's authority after being accused of violating the code for their poultry industry, particularly in matters of wages and working conditions. The Supreme Court's ruling was swift and decisive. In an anonymous decision, the court struck down the NIRA, declaring that it constituted an unconstitutional delegation of legislative power to the executive branch, and thus exceeded the federal government's authority under the Commerce Clause. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes and his colleagues emphasized that the flow of commerce regulated by the federal government must cross state lines to fall under its jurisdiction. Since Schechter's operations were local and did not constitute interstate commerce, the court reasoned Congress had no constitutional authority to regulate them. Beyond the technicalities, the court's decision signaled a broader rejection of the expansive vision of federal intervention embodied in the entire New Deal. For Roosevelt and his supporters, the ruling was a severe blow, an abrupt halt to what had been conceived as a comprehensive, coordinated effort to rescue the nation from economic catastrophe. Almost concurrently, the Supreme Court addressed challenges to the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA. The act had sought to stabilize farm prices by paying landowners to reduce crop production, thereby controlling surpluses and raising market prices. While the program provided direct financial relief to struggling farmers, it sparked immediate legal challenges. In United States v. Butler of 1936, the court ruled that the tax levied to fund the AAA subsidies was unconstitutional, declaring that the federal government could not coerce states into agricultural regulation under the guise of taxation. The court argued that such interference violated the 10th Amendment, which reserved powers not explicitly granted to the federal government to the states. Like the Schechter decision, Butler struck at the core of Roosevelt's strategy, affirming the judiciary's skepticism toward federal authority over economic affairs traditionally managed at the state or local level. These rulings had immediate political and psychological consequences. In Congress, critics of Roosevelt seized upon the court's decisions to argue that the New Deal represented an assault on constitutional governance and the principles of limited government. Conservative newspapers and interest groups denounced what they termed the imperial presidency, claiming that the administration's ambitious agenda threatened the delicate balance of power among the branches of government. Roosevelt's political capital, though still formidable, faced a sudden test. How could he pursue his vision of economic recovery when the highest court in the land appeared committed to obstructing it? The crisis also stretched into the public sphere. While many Americans supported Roosevelt's efforts to provide jobs, relief, and reform, others were alarmed by the very prospect of the executive branch wielding unchecked authority. The rulings of 1935 and 1936 crystallized a debate at the heart of American democracy. How far could the federal government intervene in the economy without violating constitutional boundaries? The Supreme Court's decisions were not merely technical legal judgments. They reflected a profound ideological contest over the role of government in shaping modern society. In response, Roosevelt considered bold measures to counteract the court's obstruction. Most famously, in 1937, he proposed the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill, colloquially known as the court packing plan that I talked about a few weeks back on an episode about challenging FDR. Now, this plan would have allowed him to appoint an additional justice for every sitting justice over the age of 70. The proposal was designed to shift the ideological balance in the court in favor of New Deal legislation, but it provoked immediate backlash from Congress, the press, and even members of Roosevelt's own Democratic Party. Critics accused the president of attempting to undermine judicial independence and consolidate power in the executive branch. Ironically, while the court-packing plan ultimately failed in Congress, the composition of the Supreme Court itself changed over the next few years. partially due to retirements and appointments, and several New Deal measures actually survived subsequent legal challenges. In particular, the court gradually adopted more permissive interpretation of federal authority under the Commerce Clause, paving the way for landmark rulings that would uphold, most importantly, Social Security, which is still around today, labor protections, and other components of Roosevelt's domestic agenda. In retrospect, the rulings of 1935 and 1936 constituted a temporary but pivotal interruption in the New Deal's trajectory. A constitutional pause, you might say, that highlighted the tension between innovation and legality in times of crisis. The confrontation between Roosevelt and the Supreme Court exemplified the delicate balance inherent in the American constitutional system. Executive ambition, legislative experimentation, and judicial restraint all coexisted within a framework designed to prevent tyranny. Yet the fear of economic collapse tested the very limits of those safeguards. The challenges faced by the New Deal do illustrate how crisis of unprecedented scale can generate both constitutional innovation and conservative backlash, forcing leaders to navigate a very complex institutional landscape while maintaining public confidence and political legitimacy. Moreover, the moment when key New Deal programs were declared unconstitutional really highlighted the fragility of reformist initiatives in the face of entrenched institutional power. Roosevelt's response, careful recalibration of policy, political negotiation, and eventual adaptation to the court's constraints demonstrates the interplay between legal authority and practical governance. Had the court ruled differently, or had Roosevelt mismanaged the political fallout, the trajectory of federal economic policy and social welfare in the United States might have diverged dramatically from the path that it ultimately unfolded. You know, no Social Security. Anyway, thanks for listening.